hello everyone. I'm not going to speak from the pulpit. I think it's appropriate that we all sit down here. And I'd like to make this as informal as possible in a sense, seeing we're going to range quite widely. And the three speakers that you have are all going to talk about different aspects of the housing issue. But let me start by putting it in a little bit of context. So we're in an economy in the midst of an enormous structural change. We went through a big structural change during the mining boom when we shifted resources into servicing high levels of mining investment. And that mining investment is just about finished falling now because the super cycle didn't last forever. We basically invested enough to supply all the demand that was required. But it came at the expense of a high dollar and constraint on non-mining economies, particularly dollar-exposed economies and services economies, and New South Wales is just one such. As the mining boom receded, people have been waiting for non-mining business investment to come through to drive growth. We're not ready to invest yet in Australia. There's still plenty of excess capacity, demand is weak, profits are weak, and there's no way business will invest in this environment. And just when we get through the negative impact of the fall in mining investment, we're about to face a downturn in residential building. Not housing, necessarily, residential building. So I hear a lot of people say that this cycle is different, that prices have gone up more than they ever have before, that affordability is a huge issue, and that debt is an enormous issue because we're all vulnerable to increases in interest rates. And if I could say to you, we've done this all before. We've seen similar orders of magnitude of price rises through previous cycles. I think about 2 of them in the past 30, 35 years. And this one's over, finished. Not because of oversupply, interestingly. Usually that's what turns a cycle down. But because of an extraordinary regulatory policy. Now, I say extraordinary because I've rarely seen regulatory policy nip a cycle in the bud. Usually it runs its course and we oversupply dramatically. And the regulation wasn't really particularly interested in individuals. They were interested in the health of the banks. They didn't want any defaults on their mortgages. But what happened was that APRA talked the banks into raising interest rates. And I've got to tell you, that wasn't very difficult for investors, for interest-only loans. In any case, the bank's margin above cash rates, the Reserve Bank's cash rate, is pretty high. I would think that it should be about 1.5% to 2% in a normal competitive environment, and it's almost 4%. And at this stage of proceedings, we've discouraged the investors that started the boom. Now, to some people, investors are the bad guys in all of this. But New South Wales has been undersupplied for a decade before this upswing came along, for a variety of reasons which we can go into later. And we were waiting for investors to come along and kickstart the upswing in building that was required to start to satisfy the deficiency of residential stock. So a level of building that came through was really warranted. Now we're building more than the demand is now, but we're still running down the deficiency of stock, and this boom, in New South Wales at least, will end with a deficiency of stock at the end of it. Finally, when the investors came in, of course, then you couldn't beat them off with a stick, and the built-up momentum, and basically this was a very unusual cycle, as all are, but this time because it was led by investment apartments. And so developers, to get an investment apartment away, need to get a certain level of pre-commitments to be able to bank the project, to get finance. As we proceeded through a number of these, prices rose to a level at which the residual land value had risen significantly allowing people to consolidate sites for new development, and all became self-fulfilling. But now the music has stopped. Again, not because of oversupply, but because we've discouraged investors by raising interest rates, by requiring them to have a lower loan to valuation in their borrowings. We've discouraged developers by requiring from them higher levels of pre-commitment, higher levels of equity, and raised interest rates on them as well. And so now the boom is over, not because of oversupply, but because we can't get the high-rise projects away that were driving the strength of building activity. And all of this at a stage where the market is still undersupplied. Now, there is a good thing in this. See, normally cycles run longer and stronger, and we oversupply markets dreadfully, and then we have a collapse not only in building but in housing prices. But in this cycle, we're more likely to see a setback to some of the more oversupplied components. Well, Sydney actually didn't oversupply anything, but we have built a lot of apartments, and the people who will wear the problem are the people who accumulated the sites and now won't be able to get them away as projects, i.e. the developers, left high and dry with sites eating their heads off in costs, but not able to do anything with them. But there won't be a big setback to apartment prices or unit prices in the suburbs or housing prices through this cycle, even though our expectation is that the number of residential commencements will fall, or our forecast is by 31% over the next 3 years. Now, that's not all good, because residential is a mainstay of growth in the economy, and basically that means a negative setback to growth for the next 3 years coming out of the residential market, offset because we've got infrastructure spending strong, offset because we're seeing a resumption of growth in services which had been in abeyance since the GFC. And of course, we haven't got any mining downturn left. That finished about 2 years ago when we finished off New South Wales coal projects, though Western Australia and the Northern Territory still have 2 big gas projects to finish off, so there's still a negative impact there. We're focusing on New South Wales. And so here we sit in a market, which is not oversupplied, it's still undersupplied, where the level of building is turning down dramatically, and so we're setting ourselves up for a shorter downturn leading into the next cycle, but in any case, there's at least 3 and probably 5 years before we see the next cyclical upswing. Now, there are problems that arise when you see strong levels of housing prices, and we'll be talking about that in a second. But I must say, affordability, I think, is an issue, which is a social issue. And if we really want housing to be affordable for first home buyers, then we have to subsidise them in some way. And somebody has to pay that subsidy. I think the much more serious problem is affordability for renters, because they're the people with less income and less, effectively, capital who can't afford to rent a house in many cases. So some sections of the community can and will, and there always have been people that rented in the Australian economy, remember, and they lived a bit higher off the hog through their working lives in relation to the proportion of income that they had for discretionary expenditure, i.e. what was left over after paying the mortgage. But they didn't have the house's superannuation at the end of the day, and that's proved to be a very strong and stability for those sorts of families. But the people who really suffer are those who can't even afford to pay the rent. And that, of course, is a social welfare problem. And so people talk to me about the affordability of housing, and I think, yes, we should try to subsidise. Let's not subsidise only new building, because that's not the problem. In fact, first home buyers shouldn't be buying, whiz-bang new 4-bedroom houses in the suburbs. They should be buying an old apartment in a block somewhere, doing it up, and then gradually moving their way through the system. They're prevented in that because every time you move, you pay 10%. And a lot of that's in stamp duties, and that doesn't make sense. So we used to move, on average, 7 times through our working lives. Now it's less than 6 times through our working lives. And we're more likely to do up the house we're in because of the cost of moving. And I think that's a problem, because we really want to get people into the system, and I agree we should want to get people into the system. We need then to bite the bullet and say, okay, we're willing to subsidise them. But the social welfare problem, I think, is extreme, and I'm quite shocked, in a sense, when I see what happened. I used to get shocked at in America 40 years ago. You'd walk around in America, and there were people living in boxes on the street. And this is the country of Disneyland that I grew up with, and I thought, well, hang on, it might be pretty in the centre, but if you don't have a job and work in the society, you fall off the edge. There's no safety net. Now in Australia, I always thought we had a safety net. But if I see people living on the streets now in Sydney, I think, well, our safety net is failing. And for me, that's the much more extreme problem. Let me come back to the topic. See, I'm just a forecaster. I'm not the one who's going to give out the money for the social welfare. And I'm not a great believer in governments intervening in markets. Markets do what markets do. You can steer them a little if they don't do what you want them to, and that can be quite sensible, but usually governments, I think, what's the technical term, stuff it up. But at the end of the day, we now have a housing market which has got to where we are. If you're not going to intervene, we know pretty much what it's going to do, because the market phenomenon is pretty straightforward. And what we have to do is to decide whether we really want to intervene, and we're willing to pay the price of intervention and the cost of stuffing it up as well. That's where I'm going to hand it over. Thank you.